Nationalism, next on One Norway Street. Welcome to One Norway Street from the home of the Christian Science Monitor. I'm Schuyler Sackett. Today we focus on the crisis in the Middle East with a European perspective from Britain's Brigadier General Kenneth Hunt. But first, the call of Arab nationalism. In his flowery rhetoric, Iraq's President Saddam Hussein has announced a new sunrise for the Arab world, blotting out the black darkness of foreign domination. Saddam Hussein has characterized his army's conquest of neighboring Kuwait as a step towards reintegration of the Arab homeland. But leaders of the Arab League, who met this month in Cairo to respond to the challenge of Iraq's aggression, were not persuaded. 12 Arab states voted to condemn Iraq's military adventure, and Egypt, Syria, and Morocco have already sent troops to support Saudi forces in the face-off against Iraq in the Arabian desert. And yet, in many parts of the Arab world, from Jordan to Libya to Mauritania, thousands have rallied to support Saddam Hussein and his vision of a new Arab nation. Two guests join us to discuss the resurgence of Arab nationalism. Professor Farouk El-Baz of Boston University is an internationally respected geologist from Egypt. He served as science advisor to Arab leaders including Anwar Sadat and Jordan's King Hussein. John Esposito of the College of the Holy Cross is a professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies. He's director of the Center for International Studies. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Professor El-Baz, let's start out by the most basic question. What exactly are the Arab nations of the world today?
The Arabs have three components when you define an Arab. The Arabs speak the same language. They have the same cultural roots, and they have the same aspirations. And these aspirations are three: freedom, unity, and well-being. No matter who said these words or when, they really vary very little, but these are the specific aspirations of the Arabs. They were said at the very beginning of the Arab revolt by the grandfather of King Hussein. They were said more recently by President Nasser of Egypt, and we hear them today from President Saddam Hussein of Iraq.
Professor Esposito, what's the distinction between the idea of Arab nationalism and the religion of Islam? Because, for example, President Hussein has called for an Islamic holy war also, as well as his calls for Arab nationalism.
Well, I think the point that most people miss is that not all Arabs are Muslims. I mean, that in fact, Arabs can be Muslims, Christians, Jews in background. And in fact, to my understanding, the current foreign minister of Iraq is a Christian. But we tend to often to equate the two. Also, there have been times when Islam has been used among the Muslims of the area to buttress Arab nationalism. And so that plays into the notion.
Let's talk some more about what the goals of the modern-day pan-Arab movement are. I think from the viewpoint of Saddam Hussein and his party, the goal is a revolution or force to overthrow the pro-Western governments of the Arab world. Is that right?
It goes back to this, the 3 points that we mentioned, this freedom, unity, and the well-being, because freedom, the Arabs consider this as their #1 aspiration, because during the last century, they were under the Ottoman rule, and many of them suffered greatly for that. And then during the first part of this century, the colonial powers of England, France, and Italy had divided the Arab world amongst them. And then the well-being is an aspiration for better life. So all of these aspirations come under the heading, under the #1, which is freedom, meaning that I do not want any foreigner on my land. They certainly have an aversion towards that. And then they know that their well-being will come only if there is unity. The only difference between the old-time view of unity under the same banner, under the same party, or under the same president or king or whatever, is what we see today is that unity is possible with the Arab world in different countries. They don't have to become under the same rule to be united.
When you say that an Arab would say, I don't want a foreigner on my land, does a Kuwaiti say, look at an Iraqi soldier as a foreigner on his land?
Well, I think for many Kuwaitis, the extent to which Iraq has come in and taken over their country, they would see it precisely that way. But I'd just like to compliment what Professor El-Baz has said. What Saddam Hussein is playing to is recent Arab history also. In the 50s and 60s, you had the rise of Arab nationalism. Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and then also the coming into power of the Ba'ath Party in 1963 through coups in Syria and Iraq. And so what he is able to play to now is the more sort of proximate sense of history and identity of the Arab nation, of Arab socialism, and Arab socialism meaning being concerned about society, about the people, about the welfare of the people, about bringing along the oppressed. And if you notice, these are themes that he's playing to. He plays not just to the Palestinian problem, but he also plays basically to the oppressed of the area and the desire to meet the needs of the Arab nation.
Does the call that he is making have a stronger appeal in areas where the Arab people have been particularly oppressed, as for example with Palestinians?
Very much so, and in the Arabs that live now in Jordan, with over the half of the population is Palestinian, they certainly feel disenfranchised. They have a gripe. They say, nobody had ever come to our rescue, and they appeal to Saddam Hussein's words, because he also mentioned that. He said, I would leave Kuwait if Israel would leave the West Bank. So these words are appealing to the masses in places like that.
What claim does Saddam Hussein have to speak as the spokesman for pan-Arab views in the world today?
He's somebody, I'd say his basic claim is that he's somebody who's come at a time when there's a leadership vacuum in the Arab world, and when in fact you have festering problems. The Palestinian problem, one has to remember very proximately the inability of the Intifada to come to real fruition because of the inability, seemingly, of the United States to be able to move Israel from a Palestinian point of view to the peace table. Also, within recent years, the sense of frustration on the part of many of the poor in the Arab world that the oil-rich Arab countries have not used their political and economic clout to rescue them, to help them resolve their political problems, to help them resolve their social problems. And so into this void steps Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein has asserted himself as the champion of the Arab cause, as the champion of the Palestinians and of the oppressed.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break, but we'll continue our discussion in just a moment. Welcome back as we continue our discussion about the spirit of Arab nationalism. My guests are Farouk El-Baz of Boston University, science advisor to several Arab leaders, and John Esposito, a professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the College of the Holy Cross. Before the break, we were talking about the role and the leadership of Iraq's President Saddam Hussein in the modern movement of Arab nationalism. 1,000 years ago, his capital, Baghdad, was the center for a vast Arab empire. How much luster does he get from those historical associations?
Well, of course, the historical associations are very important in places like that, where you had the power vacuum that Professor Esposito was talking about. And now comes somebody who has the power today, so he can bring the glory of yesteryear to the fold by bringing in images of Nebuchadnezzar and Saladin and the people that had removed foreign invasions from the Arab world and unified the Arab world, in addition to the history of Baghdad itself as a center of culture.
How much pride do Arab people today, in whatever country, take in those glories of yesteryear?
I think that for many Americans who, as somebody who's a professor, who have very little sense of their history, it's hard to understand the extent to which Arabs have a great sense of pride in their past history. And we talk about what unites Arabs. We talked about language, culture, and it's a sense of history. A sense that, you know, out of this small area, out of the area of what is today present-day Mecca and Medina, you know, within a century, for example, under the Prophet Muhammad, the Arabs were able to conquer the two great empires of the time. And then in subsequent centuries to create these magnificent empires, and in Baghdad, having established the Abbasid caliphate, to then create an enormous civilization that was to influence not only the Arab world, but even the West for centuries, down to perhaps the 18th century.
At a time when Europe was going through its dark ages.
That's right.
How different culturally do you think Arabs are from Europeans or people in the United States?
Well, it really is. The cultural differences are not really deep-rooted. It's the important aspect in the whole thing is that the Arabs, during their civilization, were quite open-minded. They took all of the texts from Greece and the ancient times, and they translated those, and they added to them. They were quite open to science and technology, developed all kinds of things, and quite opening to the world too. They went to China, they did all kinds of things in Europe. So from that aspect, they are really very much Western in mentality, so to speak. But when it comes to their living and the family life and the kinds of things that they would like to do, Islam, more than anything else, affects their culture.
I was thinking in terms of Islam being a very strong force, for example, in Saudi Arabia, and that you go to another Arab country like Algeria, which has had a socialist government for years. How great are the differences when you go from one Arab nation to another through the world?
As far as the culture is concerned, not a great deal. There are some minor differences here and there, but the cultural differences are not really deep-rooted at all. Because Islam in many ways is a way of life rather than just a religion. So that being the uniting force, even though the Christians and the Jews that lived as part of the Arabs in the Arab world, they were also affected by this Islamic culture. So that you can see that there is a relationship between all of these.
What do you think the future is for the Arab nationalist movement? At this point, it looks like Saddam Hussein is not going to continue and sweep across and conquer the Arab world. But what do you think the future for the ideal is?
Well, there are different opinions. I'm one of those people who's been of the opinion that Arab nationalism really peaked in the 50s and the 60s, and that in fact its weakness in the 70s could be seen by the extent to which Islam and Islamic revivalism were often used by governments and others to buttress Arab nationalism.
But are you rethinking that viewpoint now?
No, not really. I think that for now, I think Saddam Hussein is riding high, but he's riding high because there are specific issues right there. I don't think Saddam Hussein is the kind of man over the long run who has the ability really to emerge as the great Arab leader. I think in the midst of this kind of sort of crisis and confrontation, yes, I think somebody who stands up, I would say any Arab leader who stands up, you know, to foreign intervention, who stands up for Palestinian rights, would enjoy popular support. But to carry out that leadership over a long period of time, Saddam Hussein, I think his track record shows that that's not where his strengths lie.
Professor El-Baz, how do you see the future of Arab nationalism?
I would like to vary this a little bit by adding to the fact that because of what is happening today, and because perhaps of the initial failure of the Arab world to come to the grips of the situation and have an immediate Arab solution to the Arab problem, I think that will increase the call for nationalism in the future with a new light, rather than having the Arab nationalism being let us all get together under a single leader, but there will be a lot more cooperation and a lot more call for unity, economic unity, political unity, and so on in the Arab world. So I believe that this event, no matter how bad it is going to have a better reflection on the Arabs in general.
Do you think that there could someday be an Arab confederation of states comparable to the European Economic Community?
Very much so, and a great number of people in the Arab world are talking today about this fact right now.
For people in the United States or in the Western world in general, oil-importing countries, it can be alarming to hear the kind of conversation that has come out of President Hussein. Do you think that Arab nationalism per se is something that the rest of the world needs to view as threatening?
Arab nationalism is no more threatening as an ideology than democracy is, or than the greater Europe is. What's threatening is who happens to be in power and how situations develop between nations. But Arab nationalism per se, no, I don't think it's any more threatening. It's threatening to those powers that would like to manipulate an area. Yes, then it's threatening, because clearly, if people have a strong sense of themselves, then it means that they're not going to want to be dominated by others.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much for talking with us today. We'll continue in a moment with a British assessment of the crisis in the Middle East. Stay with us.